So I'm Peter Altmann. I am a digital identity specialist working at the Swedish Agency for Digital Government. And I'm also the Swedish representative in the Toolbox Group since 2021. I've co-authored the ARF 1.0 text that we will talk about today. And I'm also a technical advisor to the Swedish EUDI negotiation team in the trilogues.
Many thanks. So just before we move to the bit you are all waiting for, please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to Intesi Group YouTube page. Secondly, we always enjoy getting audience questions. If you want to submit a question, please put it in the Zoom question and answers. Usually we get so many that we can only cover a fraction of them, but we'll do our best. So let's take a look at the main topics we are going to cover today. We will give a brief overview of EUDI 2.0 roadmap, because we are all very interested into the timings and sequencing of the legislation and technology tracks. We also want to understand who will deliver foundational capability for the EUDI ecosystem and the role IRF plays into this picture. And for that, Peter will deep dive into the architecture and reference framework. Then we will move on to the audience question and answer. So let's get started with EUDI 2 roadmap. This is, of course, a very ambitious and challenging project of the European Union. To accomplish it successfully, we have multiple tracks at the same time. Starting with the Toolbox Expert Group publishing the IRF version 1 2 weeks before, and we will see how this IRF fits into the EUDI 2 ecosystem picture. The IRF will be updated with new versions because it's a live document. Then we have the large-scale pilots that are the early adopters of the EUDI wallet and implementation. In parallel, we have the EUDI reference wallet development. Then member states' implementation of the EUDI reference wallet will start probably next year, once the legislative process of the EUDI will be finalized. Regarding the legislative process, now we are at the moment that the European Parliament will vote the proposal, the amendments and its version. Then we'll enter the trilogue phase, where the representatives from the European Commission, members of the Parliament, and the Council of European Union will discuss those amendments, coming finally with a common version that will go for adoption. In this complex framework, we have the wallet prototype is a development of a reference application of the European Digital Identity Wallet based on the technical standard. The wallet prototype implements the Toolbox IRF and provides feedback to the Toolbox Expert Group. Then we have the large-scale pilots for consortia that have been awarded for co-founding to implement use cases at the European Union level. The large-scale pilots will pilot the wallet prototype and provide feedback to the wallet prototype developers. At the same time, the large-scale pilots will pilot the Toolbox specifications and provide feedback to the Toolbox Expert Group. The toolbox at its turn will provide the specifications for the large-scale pilots. So with that in mind, I will hand over to Peter to deep dive into the IRF presentation.
Thank you, Vicky. Let me just share my screen. Vicky and Tobin or Andrew, do you see the screen?
Yeah, it's perfect, Peter. Full screen.
Thank you. So the topic of the presentation I'm going to give is about understanding the ARF 1.0 text, focusing specifically on key takeaways and encouraging for active participation in terms of providing comments on the ARF 1.0 text, and also to ask questions in this webinar and also in other forums so that we can further develop the ARF 1.0 text and clarify our communication regarding it. So a short background to why we're having this webinar, or as seen from my perspective. As I mentioned before, I've been involved in the creation of the ARF 1.0 text. And since it has been published and since the large-scale pilot decisions have been made public, there's been a lot of questions and comments related to the ARF. And as Vicky earlier showed, the roadmap itself is quite complex. There's a lot of different moving parts that need to be aligned, and there's a lot of different ongoing discussions. And in all of this, I felt that there's a need to provide a more in-depth explanation of why certain parts of the ARF 1.0 text look the way they do, why certain parts are there, and also why certain parts are omitted. So to this end, there are a couple of resources that I can provide here. One is, and both of them are shown on the link on the screen. One is the ARF 1.0 explained text, which is a text that covers the different sections or different chapters of the ARF and provides a commentary and an explanation of why they look the way they do. The second one is the ARF commented PDF, which is the published ARF 1.0 text, but with my comments in that text. And of course, then we have this webinar, and I want to emphasize that the goal here is to facilitate a deeper understanding of the ARF 1.0 text. It is not to go through the ARF in its entirety. So for those of you who are more interested in, or for those who are more interested in how the ARF text looks like, it's better to look at the ARF text as it is published. So this webinar, I'm going to try to focus on providing a deeper explanation of why certain choices were made. So the disposition, it's a bit tricky to go through the ARF chapter-wise. So what I've done instead is to organize the presentation based on what chapters are more or less difficult or crucial to understand for someone to get a deep understanding of the ARF in its entirety. So we'll start with chapter 1. Here, the focus is on clarifying various concepts. Then we move over to chapter 4, and that part will focus specifically on answering what exactly an EUDI wallet is. Then we move over to chapter 6, and chapter 6 contains the architecture and a description of different flows. And here we'll understand better what the solution will entail. And if we have time, we will also cover chapters 2 to 3 and 5. So starting with chapter 1. The key takeaways from chapter 1 are as follows. The first one is that the ARF is a living document, and that the version 1.0 text specifically aims to enable the large-scale pilots. And it also aims to be the basis for the reference implementation. And what is key to understand here is that the 1.0 text is not the final version of the ARF. It will continue to evolve, but that the 1.0 text is aimed specifically at the large-scale pilots and the reference implementation. So when you read ARF, keep that in mind. Another key point or key takeaway is that the large-scale pilots should focus on production-ready solutions around the selected use cases, where the requirements for these use cases are set out by use case domain owners. Why I want to highlight this point is that I know that some comments regarding the ARF has been that it allows for a lot of experimentation and in essence to do whatever a certain actor wants to do with certain attestations, formats, and technologies. But this is not true. So the key focus with the ARF 1.0 text and LSPs is to have production-ready solutions around a selection of use cases with a main focus on the use case requirements that are set out by the use case domain owners. A third takeaway that is important to keep in mind when reading the ARF is that the ARF 1.0 text in itself holds no legal value, but that it was developed considering or with active consideration for the ongoing legislative negotiations. And there's also a link between the ARF and the ongoing standardization efforts, which may or may not be referenced in future implementing acts. Fourth point is that the national implementations of the European Identity Wallet must be based on the reference implementation, but they can include own software and opt out of optional modules and plugins that the reference implementation has. So the reference implementation is aiming to be open source and support a more plugin modular design, but details are pending. So I don't want to say more than I am okay to say in this setting. But if we have a modular and plugin-based design, then the national implementations are allowed to add additional things that the reference implementation does not cover. However, there's a minimum set of mandatory plugins in the reference implementation that all national implementations must include as well. There's also a mention of central services in Chapter 1 in the ARF, and there's been a lot of questions regarding what these central services entail. And at this point, it's too early to say. These are still being discussed and developed, and if it's better to wait for official Commission communication around what these central services will entail. Moving on, this slide here is very similar to the slide that Viky presented regarding the relationship between the ARF LSPs and reference implementation. The only thing I would like to add to that description is that the relationship between these three are also complicated or involve other actors and entities. And these are, for instance, the implementing acts and the delegating acts, the standards and specifications that are being developed, the ongoing legal negotiations, and existing national solutions that different member states need to ensure compatibility with. So this is kind of a summary of the two slides Viky showed earlier in terms of the roadmap and the relationship between the different components. So with that, we have covered what I believe are important takeaways of Chapter 1, and we can go on to Chapter 4. Now, Chapter 4 is a crucial chapter because it details the wallet-related life cycles. And we can begin with this slide where there is a good description in the ARF regarding what exactly an EUDI wallet is. And there are multiple different concepts here, and they can be sort of confusing. So it's important to note that an EUDI wallet can mean different things also in different contexts. But focusing on the ARF itself, we have the EUDI wallet-related lifecycle that is presented here. So an EUDI wallet provider, which is a role in the ecosystem, will provide a wallet solution. Now, this wallet solution has a separate but at times related lifecycle with what is called an EUDI wallet instance. And this is a little bit tricky to understand, but I hope it becomes a bit more clear on the next picture. So if you keep this picture that is currently on the slide in mind as we move to the next ones, we can now focus on the top left box. And an EUDI wallet solution will begin with what is named as a candidate state. Now, in this candidate state, it's fully implemented and it requires certification as an EUDI wallet and so on. And it's a feature compliant product or solution that the different member states can choose to select as their own national implementation. It doesn't mean that a wallet like a wallet solution provider needs to be approved by the member state before it can offer an EUDI wallet solution. Now, if the member state approves a certain candidate wallet solution, then that candidate wallet solution enters the valid wallet solution state. And in this state, it is made available by the member state for users to download and run on their devices. Now, the state changes from the valid state to the suspended and the withdrawn state are inherited by the instances of the wallet solution. And that is what the next slide focuses on. So, and this is also what I meant with the EUDI wallet instance lifecycle being dependent on the wallet solution lifecycle in the earlier slides. So, an EUDI wallet instance starts from a valid EUDI wallet solution, which was described on the previous slide, and it enters an operational state once it is downloaded and installed, or if the PID is expired and revoked. And I'll get into what the PID is a little bit later. So the key takeaway here is that as soon as you download an approved EU or a valid EUDI wallet solution, you can use it as a user in some limited functionality in an operational state. Now, once PID, so a PID set is a particular data set that contains attributes that is used to identify a user, and where a member state can guarantee that those attributes represent a particular user. Once that PID set is bound to an EUDI wallet in its operational state, that triggers the state transition from the operational state to the valid state. So in this valid state, the EUDI wallet instance is now recognized as a valid EUDI wallet instance, and it has full functionality and recognition as an EUDI wallet. And then, of course, we have a state transition to deactivate it if the user deletes their app, for instance. So with these slides or these explanations, I hope we have an idea of what the different state transitions are and what exactly an EUDI wallet is. But a couple of, to just emphasize the point is that every EUDI wallet solution must be certified and listed in some yet to be specified way. And every PID provider must be included in a trusted list, again, with details pending. And it's very important to distinguish between an EUDI wallet solution and a valid EUDI wallet instance. And to help with that, or to make that distinction, it's important also to consider that the EUDI wallet instance can exist in two separate and distinct states. The operational state with limited functionality and a valid state where it has the PID bound to it that has full functionality and is now officially recognized as an EUDI wallet instance. I could briefly mention why this design choice was made, but I think I'll save that once we get to chapter 6, because the technical limitations that motivated this particular design will become apparent in chapter 6. Moving on to chapter 6, the key takeaways here is that the standards and specifications chosen and mentioned in the ARF 1.0 text were based on public availability of the included specifications and standards. So when you see a standard or specification mentioned, it doesn't necessarily mean anything except for the fact that that particular standard was served a purpose or could serve a purpose for the EUDI wallet, and that it was publicly available. It is not an indication of a target standard, and it's also not an indication of a preferred standard or specification. Another key consideration, except for the public availability, is that we wanted something that was as agnostic as possible to the use cases that we were aiming to try out. And what I mean by that is, since we needed to reduce the complexity of the wallet, it meant that we were looking for solutions that could support as many use cases as possible, which, as I mentioned, was the second factor that we took into consideration when choosing between standards and specifications. Now, with that said, a second key takeaway is that there really is a lack of mature standards and technical specifications and associated open source libraries. So I know there's an ongoing discussion at the Commission with regards to the possibility to encourage open source contributions, but details are pending, and I don't want to say anything other than this. And I also want to mention that these standards and technical specifications are very important for the implementing act, so maturity really is a key target that we should aim for. Now, I'm aware that there might be some disagreement on what exactly a mature standard means and entails, but we could have this discussion in another forum if there are a lot of comments related to this. A third key takeaway is that the EUDI wallet app, so the particular app that you'll download on your mobile phone, can rely on external resources for various functions. An example of this could be that there might be the certain national implementations of the wallet might rely on external hardware resources to protect cryptographic secrets. But other functionality may also rely to some degree that is not yet specified on external resources. So the key takeaway here is that it's not every resource necessary to provide the wallet functionality has to be on the mobile device itself. Moving on to the fourth point, this is one of the, it's a bit tricky to understand this one as well. So hopefully we can, or I'll make an attempt. There are two initial EUDI wallet configurations included in the ARF. Now, additional ones may be added, and I do emphasize may here. And these configurations were designed as a way to address the challenges inherent in balancing the need for flexibility with the need to reduce complexity of a solution. So a little bit on the background here, it's very difficult to satisfy all the use case requirements with one simple solution. I would argue that it's impossible. So it was quite clear that the EUDI wallet solution needed to support or needed to include support for multiple different particular solutions. But that, of course, adds to the complexity that we also want to reduce. So the configurations were was the result of this attempt to manage this trade-off between flexibility and complexity, where we initially mentioned two types. So the type 1 configuration is mainly focused on the PID attestation and attestations that share similar requirements with the PID attestation. To mention a few points here, type 1 attestations are tightly coupled or have tightly coupled life cycles between the PID and the wallet instance and the QEA itself. So if the PID is revoked, the QEAs that are issued to the type 1 configuration will no longer be usable because they're tightly coupled. Whereas in type 2, we are aiming more for a loosely coupled solution where QEA that is still valid can be used, even if the wallet instance is in an operational state where it no longer has a valid PID. A second example of what distinguishes the different configurations is that in type 1, we strictly enforce non-exportability of cryptographic secrets, which of course impacts functions like backup, recovery, multi-device support, and so on. In type 2, this non-exportability of secrets is somewhat relaxed, which would then open up for additional or for alternative ways to do synchronization, backup, and recovery. It also opens up for multi-device flows that the type 1 configuration doesn't. But it's key to mention here that Type 2 is focused on supporting use case requirements that cannot be satisfied by Type 1. Type 2 is not to be interpreted as, a sandbox where you can experiment freely with whatever type or technology or attestation format or protocol that you want. So whatever we do or whatever activities going on within a Type 2 configuration, it needs to be anchored in the use case requirements that are currently part of the LSP efforts as well. So a final takeaway from chapter 6 is that attestations are usable together if and only if they are from the same configuration, but not necessarily when they are from different configurations. This is not to be interpreted as choosing certain technological stacks or something like that. It's not at all related to formats or anything of the like. Instead, it has to do with how certain key functions are realized. I'll give a simple example of this. Something as fundamental as holder binding can be done in multiple different ways. And within a configuration, we are aiming to ensure that the holder binding mechanism is the same for all attestations. If they are the same, then features like selective disclosure become easy. But if they're not the same, then it's completely impossible to meaningfully combine two attestations, or rather it's impossible to make guarantees that the combination of two attestations is meaningful to the verifier. So while it is possible to share attestations from different configurations, no guarantees can be given in terms of whether or not these combinations are meaningful in any way. When they're from the same configuration, that is possible, but when they're from different, it is not. So the configurations are more meant to distinguish between key features that are mutually incompatible in terms of how they're being realized. Going down to the actual architecture that is proposed in the ARF, this is towards the end of chapter 6. I wanted to add a bit of explanation to this because it is certain parts are mandatory and other parts are not, and it's important to know which. So this is of course explained in the ARF text itself, but a visual representation might be easier to consume. So the first thing that is important to note has to do with issuance protocols, and that is that OpenID for BCI as a protocol is mandatory between the issuer and the EUDI wallet instance for the Type 1 configuration, with the exception of the PID. So the PID provisioning is entirely up to each member state. The member states do not have to issue the PID using OpenID for BCI, but every other attestation that is issued to the Type 1 configuration of the wallet needs to support OpenID for BCI. Now, other optional protocols are allowed, but we do not guarantee support for it. And this is what I meant before, that there might be differences in the national implementations, but widespread support is not guaranteed unless you focus on the issuance protocol that is here listed as a must. Focusing on the EUDI wallet instance itself, specifically the data models and formats, we see that for the Type 1 configuration, every wallet, the reference implementation and every national implementation needs to support two. The first one is the W3C verifiable credentials with the JSON and JOT flavor, more specifically the STJOT. And the second one is the one mentioned in ISO 18013-5, which is the CBOR and MSO combination. So all wallet solutions must support both formats. And there are some discussions on how exactly the PID will be issued, but these discussions have included the option to issue the PID in both formats and make that mandatory. Now, I want everyone to note that the entirety of the Type 2 configuration is actually completely optional in every national implementation of the wallet. So if it is supported, even the data formats, data models and the formats are more or less optional. So we have a few, or we have the three that are listed here, where JSON and JSON LD with JOTs, and the ISO 18013-5 ones are should requirements, whereas the JSON LD with the LD proofs is a may requirement. So I want to emphasize here again that the type 2 configuration is not to be interpreted as an area for totally free experimentation. It is meant to afford a greater degree of flexibility than the type 1 configuration in order to meet the use case requirement set out by the use case domain owners. Moving to the attestation exchange protocol between the wallet and the relying party, we note that for remote flows, so in other words, flows that happen online, OpenID for VEP and SIOP v2 are must requirements for the type 1 configuration. For proximity flows, it's the ISO 18013-5 MDOC request response that will be mandatory for all wallets. Now, the same protocols are may requirements for type 2. And the may requirement doesn't mean that you cannot use the flows mentioned as must for type 1. It simply means that you can use additional protocols if the ones here do not satisfy your use case requirements. So that is it for chapter 6. I'll briefly mention chapters 5 and the others because we're doing pretty okay on time. So chapter 5 has to do with the PID issuance, the PID itself, PID issuance and QA issuance. And I think a couple of key takeaways when reading that section of the ARF is that the PID attestation contains both mandatory and optional ADAS attributes. However, the mandatory set is the intersection of what all member states can provide. And this is, of course, quite a limited set, and it's not entirely certain that it will allow for unique identification on its own. So there's been the addition of a unique identifier. I'm aware that this addition of a unique identifier in the mandatory set has received quite a lot of attention. And I just want to emphasize that we have absolutely not specified what that unique identifier should be, who generates it, where it's generated, how it's used, and so on. So while it's good that concerns around unique identifiers in particular related to privacy are voiced, there are no details yet for what that unique identifier will be. And I want to emphasize that. A third key takeaway in chapter 5 is, as I mentioned before, that there's been quite a balancing act where we wanted to reduce complexity at the same while at the same time satisfying the requirements for flexibility that the different use cases have. And this complexity / flexibility balancing is quite a tricky one to do. QEA providers can, of course, issue a QEA under the requirements applicable to the PID attestation. This goes both for the specific issuance requirements mentioned in chapter 5, but also with regards to the type 1 configuration mentioned in chapter 6. Note here that the requirements for the QEA provider or for the PID attestation and for the type 1 are optimized to reduce complexity and to enable interoperability. The second option is, of course, the QEA provider to issue a QEA under the QEA requirements. And these requirements afford greater flexibility so that specific use case requirements can be satisfied if the other requirements cannot meet these use case requirements. So again, I emphasize the flexibility afforded by the current ARF version is not to encourage experimentation and free use of whatever. It is meant to allow or afford the necessary degree of flexibility to meet the use case requirements that the LSPs will test out. Chapters 2 and 3. So chapters 2 and 3 contain a list of definitions and the use cases. And what I think or a couple of things that are important to mention here is that initially, every EUDI wallet instance will contain only a single PID. Now, this does not mean that you cannot have multiple devices, because an instance and a device are two different things. But Chapter 6 provides some guidance on how such a multi-device design could look like. But each EUDI wallet instance will contain only a single bit PID initially. It's also very important to emphasize that each member state decides what EUDI wallet solutions to endorse and recognize, and how the PID provisioning will look like. And since the PID is necessary to enter a valid EUDI wallet instance state, there is quite a heavy reliance on member states. In this regard. Third key takeaway in Chapter 2 with the definitions is that the definition for selective disclosure and also other key functions, but with particular to selective disclosure, is rather vague. And the reason for that is that selective disclosure as a function can be implemented in many different ways, and different implementations have very different resulting properties. So the later chapters, especially Chapter 6, mandates the salted digest approach for selective disclosure in the Type 1 configuration, but allows for additional approaches in the Type 2 configuration. Finally, the ARF 1.0 text recognizes that no single solution can satisfy all the use case requirements and the member state specific demands. And this is one key reason for the configurations approach detailed in Chapter 6. As I mentioned before, it's very difficult to find one solution that would fit all. And the problem with including multiple solutions in the wallet is that all of a sudden you end up with a situation where attestations issued under these different solutions are not useful together. So we needed a way to make sure that we provide the necessary flexibility while at the same time reducing the complexity and weird cases where attestations are combined in nonsensical ways. And the final point here is that the large-scale pilots are, of course, encouraged to experiment, but only where necessary to satisfy the use case requirements. So this goes back to what I mentioned before, that even though the ARF 1.0 text does afford a lot more flexibility than earlier versions of it, it is not to say that the Type 2 configuration and the EAs is, open field where you can test out whatever you want. So everything needs to be anchored in the use case requirements. And it's only when existing proposals or existing solutions, mainly Type 1 and the other things described in the ARF 1.0 text, where they absolutely cannot satisfy the use case requirements, then it's possible to try out additional solutions than the ones afforded also by the two different configurations as detailed in Chapter 6. And that is all I had in terms of a deep dive into the ARF. So I guess it's back to you, Vicky.
Peter, it was really great. Thank you. Thank you really very much. I think now is the time for questions and answers. We've got a lot of questions, so let's get started trying to cover as many as possible. Andy, could you please start? You have selected a couple of great questions. Over to you.
A couple, yeah. There's 103 questions. Actually, some of that's been chat, but I've picked out well, as many of them as I could, and some of them are kind of duplicates, so I've gathered those together. So really good questions coming in, and I should say that I think on behalf of all of us, thank you to Peter for going through the ARF like that. I think there's been a real demand to get that level of detail that Peter's brought out. So I've got a million questions. There's some still coming in. The ones that are coming in now, I probably won't be able to pay as much attention to because I'm speaking to you, and I'll be asking Peter these as well. But we'll see how we get on. And Vicky, there was one, just an administrative one. Will you be sending out a link to the recording of today's webinar to the registrant?
Yes, absolutely. A follow-up email will be sent tomorrow to all registered participants, and that email will include the link to the recorded session.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you for that. All right, so let's kick off, and maybe Peter, if you want to come on video just as we answer these. The first one, how have you handled the fact that you've got this parallel activity with the legislation going at the same time as the toolbox work? You've had to write a fairly detailed set of technical requirements when the legislation is still in progress. How enjoyable has that been, and how have you handled it?
Well, if you compare how I look today with my profile photo, I guess it hints a bit on how enjoyable it was. But on a more serious note, it has been tricky. So one of the decisions made in the Toolbox group, when we were discussing both the ARF and also during its writing, was to freeze a version of the council's report on the ADAS legislation. So the ARF text is not necessarily based on the most recent version. There's a footnote in the ARF text that details exactly what version it was based on. Now that doesn't mean that the entire ARF wasn't developed with the future proposals in mind, but there is one version that it was based on that we froze for it. In terms of the technical requirements and the legislation, this is a bit of a separate question, but related. And frankly, there are not too many ways to satisfy some of the requirements that are proposed in the ADAS legislation. So even though, of course, it's very important to aim for technical neutrality, there are certain mechanisms that allow you to do certain things in the ADAS legislation. So the solution space is not endless. It's not, infinite. So already early on, just reading some of the requirements that a lot of member states seem to agree to, and they were not controversial in any way, we could kind of guess what technologies or mechanisms could satisfy them. So, and yeah, then certain of these mechanisms would require quite advanced techniques that perhaps the public sector could not support as it is. So when deciding on which technique to make mandatory and which technique to make optional, we took also into consideration whether or not it was targeted for the public sector or if we wanted to allow for only for industrial or private sector usage.
Yeah, and there's a couple of questions on that that came a bit later. So if we have enough time, we'll definitely get down to that. So yeah, it sounds like it's been quite a lot of fun so far anyway, and more fun still to come, I think, is probably a good summary. There was a question about the two different configurations. That generated a lot of Q&A about the two different configurations and the states and the PID binding and so on. Maybe the easiest thing would be if you could give a couple of example use cases, one that would need an operational wallet and one that would need a valid wallet, just to sort of bring it home for people as to what that would mean in their daily lives.
Okay, so what I'm about to say is not an indication of use cases that will be tested in the LSPs. It's only a use case where I could exemplify the distinction between these two. So take, for instance, a credential or an attestation that doesn't contain any personal information. So it could be a bus ticket or some right that acts like a bearer credential. So if it's not personalized and it is still valid, it becomes a little bit difficult to motivate why such an attestation should be rendered useless if the PID is revoked. Whereas in other cases, it's crucial that whatever attestation is bound to the PID is revoked when the PID is revoked as well. So that second one, I'll leave to the audience to decide, or someone else could give an example of it. But I think the motivation for the one where where they're not so impacted is where the life cycle between the different attestations need to be separate. And in some cases, it can be that it doesn't have personal information, it's more of a bearer credential, but it could also be cases where you simply don't want a still valid attestation to be revoked if the PID is revoked. And an example of that could be your driver's license. Like it doesn't make a lot of sense if you take the analogy to the real world. If you lose your passport, that shouldn't mean that you can't use your driver's license. And in a similar fashion here, if the PID is revoked, you want some kind of independence between the PID and some attestations. Now, I emphasize again, this is not a general requirement for all use cases, and what I mentioned may or may not relate to the use cases in the LSPs. It's mostly just to explain the rationale behind this particular choice.
Yeah, and it's giving that flexibility then, isn't it? That there'll be some areas that are quite tightly controlled from a regulatory perspective, and others that are less tightly controlled, or they're in a non-member state regulation or trust framework. So, for example, my employer could issue me an employee credential I could use, and they would have rules over that are completely separate from the legislation that involves the issuance of a PID attestation.
I don't want to comment on that. I think this is something that we will have to see in the LSPs as well, but technically what you mentioned could be such a use case, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Peter. Now, there's quite a few questions on this as well. So a number of areas that are not yet specified, such as layer 1 verifiable data registry, the overall sort of trust relationships and so on. One assumes you're aware of these missing areas and there will be updates. Could you just explain how the ARF will evolve and if you've got a list already of things still to be added?
Yeah, so let's first address the trust one, and then we can use that as an example of how we generally approach still outstanding issues. When it comes to trust, the one key concern there is that the way we handle trust in the wallet needs to model the way trust is handled in interaction between the parties that are interacting. And in every single use case, even today, you rely on multiple different trust mechanisms and trust frameworks. So there's a need to support various solutions, but given the time we had to develop the ARF, we kind of settled with acknowledging that you have this need for multiple different ways to handle trust, and thus left it quite open in the ARF so that we didn't limit the way to handle trust to a very particular way. Now, some of these ways will be very hierarchical and centrally managed, especially if the relationship between the entities can be expressed as such. But in other cases, it may not be, and we need to enable ways that fit that non-hierarchical and non-centralized model as well. So that's in particular with the trust, but as I mentioned also, it kind of tells how we are handling the more general case of things that are not included in the ARF. So the ARF 1.0 text is an agreement between the member states, which I jokingly or somewhat jokingly say that means that most of the easy decisions are there. But where decisions are really hard to make or when they're controversial, it won't, like, and it's still up to debate, that won't be in the ARF, it will be in a backlog. So chapter 8 in the ARF, or I think it's chapter 8, it might be 7, will detail how exactly this backlog will be handled. So there is a process for backlog items, and we are currently discussing also how to handle these backlog items. It's absolutely not that if it's not in the ARF, we haven't considered it as important. It's just that we haven't had time to sufficiently address it.
Yeah, and it is version 1.0, so there's plenty more still to come, I think. Thanks for that one. A question from Doug Bullitt. Hi, Doug. Nice one, this one. How does the EU wallet interact with native wallets, e.g. Apple and Google wallets? How could it?
Yeah, so I'm a bit hesitant to answer this because I like my job, jokingly. I think it's too early to say, and it's difficult to say. we'll have to see. It depends a lot also on what the Apple Wallet and the Google Wallet will be. It depends on what the final version of the EUDI wallet will be as well. We simply do not know at this stage. As I emphasized multiple times during the presentation as well, this is the first iteration meant for the LSPs. We do not know yet what the final version will be, so it's very difficult to say how it will interact, if in any way.
Yeah, and I guess Apple and Google could come up with a wallet that satisfies all the criteria and submit it to see if they can get it approved if they wanted to, I guess.
That would be subject to member state approval.
Yeah. And I think on the large scale pilots, just to reiterate there, the purpose of those is to experiment and to try out use cases and show what works and get that feedback, isn't it? So that's very much a two-way process with the large scale pilots. It's not a one-way thing saying, take this wallet and use it and never speak to us again. It's very much interactive, isn't it, with the LSPs and the wallet developer and the toolbox team.
There will be a formal process communicated shortly on how exactly that interaction should take place or how it's envisioned by the Commission. So I'll just refrain from answering or commenting on that until that is made public by the Commission.
Okay, cool. So Henk Marsman has said, can the wallet operate as a cloud wallet, or does it have to be an edge wallet on the device, or both? And there have been a few other questions about that. So cloud wallet, edge wallet, hybrid wallet.
It's a great question. And Chapter 6, the first section of it, specifies that the mobile form factor, the mobile device itself, doesn't have to have all the key resources necessary to provide the wallet functionality. Now, that particular phrasing opens up for solutions where you could have both cloud wallets and hybrid wallets and so on, but those are not without their challenges. So a cloud wallet has certain benefits, it also has certain challenges, and the various ways we could do this, but there's no one best way, because otherwise that's the one we would specify. So I would argue that for now, there is quite a lot of openness in various ways to design these national implementations of the wallet, which may or may not include a cloud component or be more edge-based or even these hybrids. But we'll have to see what the different member states experiment with.
Yeah. And so it's going to come down to, does it comply with the requirements that are laid down in the ARF and the legislation, presumably, and experimentation within that is permitted during the LSPs. So let's have another one from Frode Nielsen, who says, Peter's slide that mentions that member states must use the reference implementation. I don't read that. I don't read 131 in the ARF like that. Did I miss something? So member states must use the reference implementation. That's the reference implementation of the wallet, which is the first iteration of it.
So it's correct that the ARF doesn't specify this process. It will shortly be detailed and formally communicated how the Commission views the process, if they decide to do so. But it's still something that is being discussed, and that's why it's not in the ARF. But in the dialogues we've had, and I don't think this is controversial in any way, there's a strong dependency between the national implementations and certain parts of the reference implementation. But here again, the details are pending, and we should wait for a formal communication from the Commission.
Yeah, thanks. I think that might be the answer to a few more of these questions that come up. And I think we should just let the audience know that there's some things you just can't answer, Peter, despite the depth of knowledge you've got at the moment. There's a lot of wheels still turning. But this might be an interesting one. So Giriraj Daga says, what are the opportunities for private businesses to innovate and create additional value on top of the wallet prototype and participate in the large-scale pilots? Not quite a toolbox question, but more of a, is this all member states, or does the private sector get a say as well?
So I'm a bit careful here. Again, I think part of this question should be answered by the LSP consortia in terms of how open they are to engage with additional actors. But the parts that are relevant for the toolbox and the ARF, I go back to two things I mentioned. The first one is that the ARF 1.0 text is focused on the LSPs as they are today. So it's difficult to say what kind of innovation and opportunity for experimentation will be afforded after the LSPs. But during the LSPs, they're very focused on the LSPs and the use case requirements that are set by the use case domain owners within the LSPs. So the experimentation there, I would argue, but with an asterisk here, I'm not entirely confident, but I would argue that it would be limited to satisfying those use case requirements if what is specified in the ARF is not enough to satisfy those use case requirements. And I am aware that there are certain use case requirements that may not be satisfiable using the ARF text as it looks today. And this would be one such opportunity where experimentation and innovation could be conducted and done. However, this should probably be done in close communication with the LSPs, the reference wallet implementer, and the commission as well.
Yeah, and maybe I could just speak as somebody who's in an LSP. I know you are, Peter, but you're in your toolbox role here. So I think pretty much most of the 4 LSPs do have private sector involvement, and certainly the EUDI wallet consortium that we're in. Jen is a private company, Intesi, that Viky works for as well. I would say largely that the ship is somewhat sailed for people who want to still get involved. I think that might, it depends on different consortia, but some might still be some options to get involved. But largely the grant process is well underway at the moment, and people who've applied and been involved in the bidding process, that's already been fairly well settled. So still some room to get involved, I think, but the ship's kind of left the dock and is not quite out of sight, but is moving anyway. Somebody asked how you can find out who the current LSP consortia are. Where is that info listed? I can't remember where that is. Maybe somebody could answer that in chat that's more knowledgeable than me. Anyway, let's pull it back to Peter's specific area of expertise. Here's a nice one for you, Peter, from Roman Zun. Does PID binding on a smartphone require particular requirements on the smartphone? Like, are older phones not possible to use because of this?
There are certain hardware requirements, yes. What that means in terms of which phones we can use or not, that kind of depends on certain ongoing processes as well. So there are a lot of moving parts here. It depends on the smartphone platform manufacturers, ongoing legislation, and so on. So I cannot say anything about that. What I can say something about, though, is the Chapter 6 requirements again. So as detailed in Chapter 6, the first part of it, you are allowed to use other resources for to provide certain functionality if your mobile device cannot satisfy the requirements. So take an older phone that might not be able to provide the necessary guarantees of hardware protected non-exportability of cryptographic secrets. And in that case, you could rely on some, say, external smart card, an HSM, or anything else. So the key resources to provide functionality do not all need to be in the wallet. And this is also an area that might encourage certain variation and experimentation with different wallet designs.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? I think some technical details still to be ironed out there to see the capabilities that you'll have with the wallet on the handset itself. There's one here from Christian Hyman. Hi, Christian. Regarding the operational state, what is a concrete example of limited functionality? And I think this sort of operational state, valid state thing is going to vex people for a little while. I'm still getting my head around it as well. But can you give us an example of what you could do with limited function? What would limited functionality be in the operational state?
unclear. It's just that we can't guarantee full functionality. I think you should interpret it more as such. But one thing that is entirely obvious is that in cases where you need a valid PID to interact with the relying party, then of course you won't be able to use anything from the wallet when it's only in an operational state. So it's not necessarily that the station has limited functionality in the operational state. It might be that your ability as a user to interact with certain relying party is limited because your wallet does not have a valid PID and is thus not recognized as a valid EUDI wallet instance.
Yeah. So there's some operational state and valid state. You can download the app as a user. Let's say, I don't know, you're speaking to your bank, for example, and they want to give you proof of a bank account. You could download the wallet, or whichever wallet in your country that's been approved, and the bank could load an attestation into that wallet that you've got a bank account, and you could then go use that somewhere else without ever needing a PID in there. So you don't have to sort of, I call it maybe stepping up, but you don't have to go through the process to get a PID in order to do a transaction like that with your bank and the estate agent you're renting a property from, for example.
That's the intent in the ARF. That doesn't mean that every national implementation will support the necessary configurations that would allow a wallet to be in operational state. Because keep in mind that the Type 2 configuration is completely optional, and it's not entirely certain that attestations issued to the Type 1 configuration do not have some kind of linkage with the PID. So it might be that the PID is absolutely essential to be able to issue anything to the Type 1 configuration. So, but if there is a Type 2 configuration in the national implementation, and if there is no valid PID in the wallet, you should be able to use it as you described, but without then guaranteeing that there will be.
Yeah, and that's a good caveat, actually, just to stress. You did say it in your presentation, but the Type 2 piece is optional at present, so may not come at all in some national implementations. Bo, Harold, and Enrico Perves, hi to both of you, asked the same question, or same-ish question. How can the ARF and OWF, so Open Wallet Foundation, so I don't think we have enough acronyms, so let's have another one. How can the ARF and the Open Wallet Foundation produce global interoperability together? And can the Open Wallet Foundation help create an open source library? So for those who don't know about the Open Wallet Foundation, recently launched initiative that is looking to really drive open interoperable wallet capability.
This is one of those questions that are difficult to answer because, again, it depends on a lot of moving parts. So first of all, we don't know what the Open Wallet Foundation will result in and what it looks like a year from now. We also have, at the moment, limited understanding of how exactly the reference implementation will look like, what kind of module and plugin support it will have, and who will be allowed to contribute modules and plugins to the wallet, and so on. So there's a lot of details pending. And again, I would advise, or I would urge everyone to wait for official communication from the Commission, if there will be any regarding this topic. So, but from a more general perspective, and not only focused on OWF, but also other initiatives that are active within this space, what I can say is that I have noticed that there is this move towards move away from these monolithic wallet designs towards more modular plugin-based wallet design. And this is not only for OWF, but as I said in general. So then of course there is an opportunity here to coordinate between efforts that are trying to use the same kind of formats, the same protocols, and so on. But at the same time, it's very important to be careful with the release engineering of various modules and components so that we don't create chaos and an environment where nothing is interoperable because everyone has their own interpretations and versions and so on. So there is an opportunity. There are also risks associated. Of course, there are ways to manage it in larger and more complex open source projects, but we will simply have to wait and see how the Commission envisions the interrelation between external parties such as the OWF and others, and the LSP and the ARF development. It's not something that I can detail.
Sure. So yeah, we'll see how that evolves. It'd be interesting to see what the OWF creates as it moves forward. Just on the topic of multiple protocols, as someone who's been deeply involved at the coalface of developing a credential wallet when I was at Evening, it was really hard getting a wallet to work just using a single protocol, which was Aries in our case. Here we're looking at a wallet with, if it was type 1 and type 2, I think I added up maybe 4 or 5 potential protocols in there. Do you think that's going to cause an issue, and is that a symptom of there not being one protocol that could do everything? Could like a master protocol emerge from this, a protocol for the whole lot that does everything offline, online, NFC, not present, etc., etc.? Could that happen? And do you think that could be an intent of all the development activity that's happening here to create that universal wallet protocol for all?
From the toolbox's perspective and the LSPs, I think this is a question that I hope the LSPs can shed additional insights into and light on. My personal opinion is that I highly doubt that one such protocol can emerge. And there are multiple reasons for this, but one particular one that I keep going back to is that the EUDI wallet intends to work for both close proximity flows that are more terminal based and tend to rely on the heritage of smart card based flows. But to a very great extent, it also needs to support web flows. And I mean, even the problem definitions are completely different between these two very important flows or areas, or whatever to call them. And there are best practices and lessons learned in both that need to be taken into account. And it's very difficult, even when you just put them next to each other, to say that this one is better than that one, because there is no grounds for comparison in many cases. So this leads to a situation where, yeah, we could probably do certain things that are optimized to web flows where we don't have to rely on too many. And that's where this agnosticism comes in, where we can have loosely coupled parts also between the components. I think that's very doable for the web flows. But at the same time, also supporting this, also having the same solutions for the terminal flows, I just don't see how that's possible. I mean, the devices are completely different. Ones, some are research constrained, others are very, very powerful. The security assumptions are different. Everything is just different. So it's difficult to envision how one such solution could look like. I think the best we can do is to reduce it to as few as possible that are as flexible as possible. But one single one, I highly doubt personally.
Yeah, certainly not in the short term anyway. There's a separation, isn't there, between the type 1 configuration and the type 2 configuration, in that they can't be mixed together, can they? So if I wanted a proof from you, Peter, that had something from your PID and something that was type 1 and something from your bank account that was type 2, you can't give me a single proof. That would have to be 2 separate transactions, right?
So you could always combine them and send them over. It's just that we can't make any meaningful guarantee that what you receive is a valid combination of the attributes. So to give a simple example, if you have 2 attestations and you want to combine attribute 1 from attestation A with attribute B from attestation, or attribute 2 from attestation B, then it is not necessarily so that the verifier or the relying party knows that these two come from two different attestations. So if you need to have some way to communicate what attestation that particular attribute is part of, and that can be done in multiple different ways. And if the attestations used completely different ways, it's very difficult to link these two attributes together in a meaningful way. And then you can get into these situations where you might create weird combinations of attributes that are actually from different identity subjects or that were not meant to be combined together. And that is one reason why these configurations were included in the ARF, is to prevent this kind of really weird combination. So it's not that you cannot present it; it's just that we cannot give any meaningful guarantees that this presentation is meaningful in any way.
Yeah. That's going to be interesting to see how experimentation works with that in the LSPs as well, for sure. I'm just noting time, by the way. We've probably got another 15 minutes to go. Still at 230 attendees, which is epic. So thanks to everyone who's holding on for this really interesting Q&A. So here's one from Oscar van de Venser in the Netherlands. Hi, Oscar. Why the member state focus? Can I, being Dutch, use a German EUDI wallet in France? I suspect this is an "it depends" answer, isn't it?
Like most answers I give. But so I'll skip the wider member state focus. I think other people can answer that better than I can. But I'll jump to the second part, which is whether or not a Dutch citizen can use a German EUDI wallet in France. It depends. It depends both on the national implementations. It depends on what you mean by use. So if we by use mean take a QEAA that is issued to the type 1 configuration and you want to present that using OpenID for VP, yes, you should be able to use it as such. But it is, at least to me, not entirely clear that you as a Dutch citizen could download the German EUDI wallet app and then get a PID issued by France. So the answer is it depends on what part of the flow and what transaction, and it depends. So in some cases you will be able to do, it's completely interoperable. In other cases, I suspect, I don't have any grounds for this, but I suspect that such completely free interoperability may be limited by national implementations or very specific national requirements.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how that evolves, actually, because I think maybe what Oscar is asking for is what a lot of members of the general public might be asking for, which is like, hey, I like the Finnish wallet because it's blue and it looks lovely and works really well, and I want to use that, and I can get my Dutch PID into that and then use it somewhere else.
But sorry, I feel that I have to emphasize that this interoperability is absolutely the intent. I just don't feel comfortable saying that it will be completely interoperable in all flows and all cases. But of course, the intent is to have an interoperable solution that citizens can use across the member state, and it shouldn't matter which flow that you have. But there are certain issues with very particular flows that may make such a complete interoperability in every single case a little bit more tricky.
Yeah, and I think the EU digital COVID certificate was a really example of success in this area, that it worked across, I think it was pretty much all member states, but of course a much simpler use case with a single credential for a single purpose, essentially. But that was a good example of that kind of interoperability and combined effort, wasn't it? Let's move on to the next one. Okay. Elena Perez and Amar Bukhari say, who will certify the wallet? The laboratory certifying today's passport or identity apps on cards? So how do you get the wallet certified as being genuine and approved for use?
I frankly do not know.
Okay,
it's not my area of expertise. Someone else has to answer this.
Excellent. Anyone who knows the answer, drop it in the Q&A there. Okay, next one. Anthony Galiamov, hi Anthony, says, you mentioned a PID becomes invalid if a user uninstalls the app. How is the question?
I think what I mentioned was that the wallet's solution enters revoked. Well, I don't remember my own slides now, but it's not necessarily that the PID becomes invalid if you uninstall the app. It's just that when you uninstall the app, you no longer have the app. And since the PID is bound to a particular device where that app is, you of course cannot use the PID anymore, that particular PID that was bound to that device.
Yeah, so this is so the PID isn't portable. You can't sort of move it to another device. If you were to swap phones, you have to go through the process again. Is that right? You have to go and get another PID.
As it is detailed in ARF 1.0.
Yeah. Okay, that's an interesting one. Thanks for that. Let's have a quick look down. Well, Andrew Budd's asked the same question twice, so we should probably, it must be important if Andrew's asking. So hi, Andrew. Is the choice of JSON and JWT for type 1 irrevocable? And what is the posture on zero knowledge proofs? I know you've looked at this in depth, Peter, haven't you?
Yeah, first I just have to check the definition of irrevocable because I'm not a native speaker, but I have it on the screen now. So yes, yeah. I would argue that the choice is final in the sense that the JSON JOT, especially the STJOT, is mandatory for category 1. The reason for this is that the salted hash-based approach that is used both by STJOT and as detailed in 18013-5 for the MDL ISO standard is a reasonable trade-off between the selective disclosure requirement and the cryptographic complexity of enabling selective disclosure in that particular way. So for type 1, for that configuration, yes, that is set. Zero knowledge proofs is a topic that we could discuss for hours and hours and hours. I will just say, I think it's one of the most misunderstood topics, and there's not really there's no point in including it in the ARF or in the legislation or anything else because it is a property of a proof system. So first you would need to figure out what exactly are you trying to prove, and then whether or not you need the ZKP property in that particular use case. And if you do, then you would need to design the protocol in such a way that it has a ZKP property. For the type 1 configuration, you could include ZKP on an attribute level. And for those who have the necessary technical skill to understand what I said, you're probably the ones who would work with doing this. For everyone else, it really doesn't matter because it's not important.
All right. Again, another one to see how that's going to evolve. We've just got 9 minutes left, so we need to leave some time for Vicky to wrap up. Here's one from Nicolo Mozzato. Will the wallet be integratable within other apps, e.g. a banking app?
Also something I do not know. This is an app design question that I'm not comfortable answering.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Let's pick another one here. Okay, Giriraj Daga again actually asked quite a lot of really good questions. So let's just pick out one more from them. Is the trusted list centralized or decentralized? So this is an area which isn't specified in much detail yet, but I imagine is in the backlog. So trusted lists is where do you go to check if the issuer of a credential is authentic, or where do you go to check that the relying party you're sharing information with is authentic, or where do you go to check a revocation register and so on?
As mentioned, there's a need to satisfy multiple different trust models, frameworks, assumptions, and we have recognized this need, but we haven't detailed it yet. It's one of those backlog items, and I suspect this will require significant alignment with the use case domain owners as well.
Yeah, and so not just one trusted list. There's not going to be like a single trusted list specified for everything in the wallet then.
I don't know how it's going to look like, but we have recognized the need for multiple different ones, and we'll have to see how it develops.
Cool, thank you for that. Let's just do another couple more. Drummond Reed, hello Drummond, up early. Just back to the PID again. Talking about the PID being bound to the device. So does that mean the PID has to be issued to each device a user may want, has to be issued separately to each device a user may want to have their wallet on? So if I've got a phone and a tablet and maybe another phone, do I need to get 3 wallets and go through the PID issuance process 3 times?
So we get back to what I mentioned before, that an instance is not the same thing as a device. It may be that you issue it to one instance, but at the same time you have multiple devices being capable of interacting with that instance. So it really depends on the national implementations. Now let's wait and see what the LSPs and the national implementations come up with. There's significant ability to test out different scenarios and solutions here. And as long as they satisfy the requirements that are for the different wallets, I don't see why one solution would be, the best. I think this will depend on the very specific national requirements as well, and what each member state decides. But it is not to say that if you have multiple devices, your ability to interact will require multiple PID issuance. It might be multiple devices, but one instance. It completely depends on what that external resource might be that your mobile phone interacts with.
Yeah. So there's clearly some flexibility for interpretation and experimentation within there as well.
More different solutions that could all satisfy this particular requirement, where we have to keep in mind that not every phone has all the necessary resources to support the functions needed, and there might also be that certain member states may favor certain solutions over others.
Yeah, got it. Okay, and we'll just stick on the PID again for a minute. Nutawat Nogsuan says on the topic of the PID, when we talk about type 1 configuration, is a PID considered a type of credential, or is it actually a QEAA, qualified electronic attestation of attributes, that contains a PID? So is the PID a credential in my parlance, or is it some kind of strange special thing that's not really a credential?
If you ask lawyers, they will say they're completely different because they are covered by different legal domains, the PID and the QEAA. If you ask me, for me, there's no difference. Like, technically, they're very, very similar. It's more that there's a legal recognition of the differences between them. With regards to whether or not QEA can contain a PID, weird construction, but you could have non-mandatory PID attributes contained in a QEA. So it might be that certain member states in their PID set want to put in things that are not mandatory, and they might issue that as a QEA linked to the PID, which is actually also an answer to another question on, in what cases would this tight linkage be important? Well, for instance, when issuing QEAs with additional attributes to your PID. So there's this legal separation between the two different concepts, but technically they're very, very similar, and it depends. We'll have to see how the different member states issue PID-related attributes, either as part of the mandatory set or as part of an additional QEA. It remains to be seen.
Yeah, gotcha. I'm just going to ask one last one that you won't be able to answer, but we'll just throw it out there to see. Get it lodged in a few people's minds. It's a really nice one just come in from Marcin Fialkowski. I hope I pronounced that roughly correctly. How will post-quantum cryptography be implemented in the wallets?
Great question. A personal favorite of mine.
Should we put that in the backlog, or?
Well, it's definitely a backlog item, but in general, what we can say is that certain formats and proof mechanisms and signature schemes are far more plug and playable than others. So and this is also where the ZKP comes in as being problematic again in certain cases, but not others. But if you take something like the 18013-5 or the S.p.A, you could sign that with whatever signature scheme. So if in a post-quantum world, just take the post-quantum signature scheme and sign the data or sign the payload that contains the salted hash digests. Completely, like it doesn't matter what the signature scheme is, it doesn't depend on the payload. But for certain other signature schemes, with particular those that are interesting because they do have ZKP properties, the data is actually closely linked to the signature itself in a way that makes that separation harder.
Yeah, interesting. I hadn't heard it explained like that. That's really helpful. And I think there are certain standards that are post-quantum, or certain protocols that are post-quantum approved by NIST and SORI-IS. I think that would be right. That would be interesting to look at as well. Okay, I think Peter will let you rest now on that. Really awesome. Thank you from on behalf of all the attendees, of which we've still got over 200 on, which is epic. So thanks very much, Peter. I think everyone gives a quiet round of applause to Peter for that. Viky, let me hand it back to you just to wrap up.
Yes, once again, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you, Andy, for your time today. And I'm really impressed by the engagement of our audience. It seems that we need another webinar just for questions and answers. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Just a reminder that this recording will be up on the Intesi Group YouTube page tomorrow. You will get a follow-up email, and that email will contain the link to this recording. We hope you will join us for future webinars. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and thank you again.